Thank you, Clark. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real honor to be with you. This seems like a really interesting place and lots of interesting work that's going on here. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about music for mental health and really the kind of foundations for this connection, I think, that lie in the biology of musical behavior and how that is essentially a framework for thinking about clinical applications. I work in a medical school, so my career has basically been translating this basic work in biological music research into applications in medicine. And this talk is really a talk in two parts. So the first talk is really going to be general. It's going to be all about the kind of biology of music. This is not the typical way that we think about music. And then moving into the applications that I've been working on. So just before I get started, a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you today is recently published in a review that connects these things, so you can look at that if you want more information. So first, just starting off with the question that kind of got me into this field, what is music? So the first thing is that as far as we know, music has always been with us. So some of the oldest specimens of musical instruments are over 35,000 years old. They come from a cave here in the Danube River Valley. And the oldest playable instruments are about 9,000 years old. They come from China. And this top flute here, I'll have a recording for you. So, you know, it's remarkable that you can find this instrument that's 9,000 years old, but then you play it and it plays in some of the same tonalities that we have today. So you have fifths in there, you have fourths. These musical intervals have been with us also for a very long time. So there seem to be some structural constraints on music on tonal music in this way. So this slide is roughly 2,000 years of history in just one slide, but I'll try to just cover it. So music has always played a central role in human culture and society. And if you look at these stories from kind of these traditional stories, they always kind of talk about spirituality, divine gift. My favorite one is this one. So music is the fifth Veda, and Brahma basically, he went away and meditated on human suffering for 1,000 years and came back with this gift of music for people to relieve sorrow and hardship. In China, there's stories of tuning pipes to the harmonies of the universe. In the Americas, we have stories of songs, rain songs to control over nature, to kind of mitigate the fears and the things that we deal with. After kind of this history in metaphysics, we have the scientific revolution, and we get into some thinking about, well, what are these sounds? So these tuning ratios that you can hear on that flute, they're based on vibrational frequencies. People start to understand the physics of vibration. They start to understand the harmonic series. So when you pluck a string, not only does it vibrate at a single frequency, but it vibrates in a whole stack of frequencies, and these have very characteristic relations. They realize that the relationships between these frequencies, even if I just in my voice, there's going to be an octave, and then the next overtone above that is a fifth, and the next overtone above that is a fourth. So these musical intervals are inherent in harmonic vibration, and this led to some interesting philosophizing. So, great, music is natural. It comes out of vibration. That's why it's beautiful. That's why we love it. That was the aesthetics of the day. In Germany, we have the advent of psychoacoustics in the 1800s. Helmholtz comes along, says, well, this doesn't really work out because in nature we have both examples of beauty and ugliness. So if something's natural doesn't mean it's beautiful. But again, always kind of music always being a focal point of all of these different disciplines. Coming to today, so we have modern definitions of music. I'm not going to spend too much time here. I know you're probably all familiar with trying to define complex concepts in human cognition or human society. Very hard to define. The point that I want to make here is that these definitions inevitably leave something out, right? And so you have a counter reaction to this where this, we're coming up with things like, okay, well, we can't really say anything other than just calling music organized sound. Then you have this guy come along, John Cage. He writes a piece that's just silence. Yeah, so you're just supposed to sit and listen to ambient sound in the room. So we can't even call it organized sound necessarily. And this really comes into the academic sphere and leads to this idea, well, there's no really single thing that we can say that music is, so we can't really talk about it. And this is reflected in current encyclopedia definitions. So this, for me, this is kind of a problem. If we can't even talk about what the phenomenon is with any sensibility, then I don't know how we can study it. And when I was a graduate student, I went to a symposium on music, and somebody asked this question at the end to the panel, like, what is music? And everybody's kind of like, no idea. So that brings me to this question here and to this field of research, which is where I started to get some traction on thinking about what music is. So this really begins with the observation that there's general similarity across our vocal behaviors. So speech and music have a lot in common. Speech and song, language and music. And what happens is they have a lot of overlap, right? They're powerfully effective, they're fundamentally social, they're auditory vocal by default. And what happens is Darwin comes along and he says, well, you know what, it's not really just speech and song, this really extends to other animals. So he brings this animal vocalization into the fore, and all of these qualities actually pertain to this whole triad of things. And what we also get then is the idea of directional change. So we start to think about, that we can think about these behaviors that we have in terms of their phylogenetic origins and to the functions they may have served in the past. So just very simply, a biology of music really focuses on music as a form of social communication, like other types of vocalization, and that shares a common origin with speech in these ancestral animal vocalization systems. We also have this kind of shift in focus from music per se to musicality. So, you might think, what is music? Well, music is Prince, or music is David Bowie, but this is really a shift away from that kind of like focus on specific cultural instances of music to musicality. So musicality is the set of spontaneously developing brain capacities that allow us to produce and perceive music. And these things are really in the context of social communication and evolution out of this system in animal vocalization. And I should say, feel free to interrupt me at any time that you have questions, anything like that. So, why am I telling you all this? What is the value of this? The value is that it leads to new questions. So, Tinbergen, famous ecologist, ethologist, basically he said that any biological phenomenon immediately raises four major questions, and these are phylogeny, function, development, mechanism. So, where did it come from? What is its value? How does it grow? And how does it work? So we can stop asking what is music, and we can say, okay, well, where did it come from? What is its value? So on and so forth. Okay, so before I'm gonna go through these separately for tonality and for rhythm, but before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about this last piece and what I regard as the most important discovery in music neuroscience over the last several decades. And that is just that taking pleasure in music drives your brain's reward system. It's very basic. You probably all know this intuitively. When you take pleasure in music, this is based in the same system that's activated when you eat something you love, during sex, drugs of abuse. This kind of core system that motivates our behavior is engaged by music, and it's engaged by it in a very forceful way. These are the core structures of this pathway. These are dopaminergic projections from your brainstem from your midbrain up into your nucleus accumbens, which you can kind of think about as a pleasure center. And the evidence here is been very consistent and mounted over the last 20 years. So early studies are injecting a radioactively labeled tracer for the dopamine receptor into your blood. I wouldn't sign up, but people did this, and what you can see is that when people are listening to music that they really love, when they get chills, the intensity of the chills is correlated with a very high degree of correlation with the activity of with dopamine binding here in your nucleus accumbens. So when you have that feeling, not everybody gets it, but if you ever get chills when you're listening to music, it's basically you're getting dopamine release in your nucleus accumbens. It happens more frequently with music than it does with other art forms. It also occurs in the context of like inspirational speech, but it's relatively rare for things like reading a book, or it seems to have an auditory component. Okay. This is just from fMRI, so this is tracking oxygenated blood flow, listening to preferred music here in red and non-preferred music in blue. This is activity in the nucleus accumbens. So just again, kind of a neural readout of this basic fact that you enjoy listening to music. And then there's also like an opioidergic aspect to this. So I don't know how much you know about reward in your brain, but dopamine is part of the signal, but there's also an opioid system component, which is kind of the hedonic part, the actual pleasurable part. The dopamine part you can think of more as like motivating you to listen and motivating you to go towards musical stimulus. But this opioidergic part is like, now you're actually taking pleasure. And if you give somebody a drug that specifically blocks this opioidergic component, you systematically decrease pleasure in response to preferred music. So this is just self-reported, how much am I liking this? And in the preferred case, when you're listening to your favorite song with and without taking this drug, you see this decrease that's significant, small n. So just to the point that this is neurobiologically real, right? Which maybe is not such a surprise, but it's really nice to have that evidence, especially from the context of trying to intervene on these systems from a medical perspective, because these are the same systems that are engaged by a lot of our psychiatric drugs. All right, so not only is it this connection here, this classical brain reward pathway, but it's also this structure here, which is the hypothalamus right in between. The hypothalamus does a lot of things for us. You can kind of think of it as like a little master control center that sits at the base of your brain, regulates endocrine function and hormones going into your blood, cortisol, oxytocin. And it turns out that when you're listening to music that you really like, these three structures become very tightly coupled in time. So they're engaged, they're kind of entrained by music, and you're getting functional, what's called functional connectivity between them. And maybe this explains some of the effects of music on stress and on cortisol levels, also on aspects of social function via oxytocin. And it's not just these three structures here, which have been redrawn like this, but actually, when you're listening to pleasurable music, your pleasure centers end up coupling to all these different areas of your brain that are involved in all kinds of things. Emotion, fear, anxiety, memory. This is your auditory cortex here. Affect regulation here in the front of your brain. This is Broca's area. Syntactical things, again, emotional regulation, how you feel in your body. So all these things that you know, all these feelings that you perhaps have had listening to music, again, there's a real, you can measure it. You can measure it in the brain. Okay, so just the summary of this piece is that music taps classical reward circuitry, the hypothalamus, and an extended network of cortical and subcortical regions that function in affect, in emotional regulation, in tension, memory, in valuation. So music is a really powerful stimulus that's affecting all of these aspects of our cognition and behavior. But the crazy thing is that it's all set in proportion to enjoyment, right? So what's going on? Why should this be the case? Why should we care so much about this type of stimulus, and why does it modulate our brain to such a high degree? And that's where these questions from biology come back in to shed some light. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about tonality and talk about its biology. So what are tones? So tones are sounds that evoke a strong sense of pitch. This is the range of a piano keyboard here, and that's really where we have our most robust sense of tonality. You often hear 20 to 20,000 hertz is our hearing range, but we don't care so much about stuff up at 15K. At least in the sense of melody. And by tonality, I just mean the use of these things to make music. So people all over the world use tones to make music. You know, you can do it in other ways. I could create music for you scratching my nails on a chalkboard, but it's probably not going to be that popular. So the first thing is to think about, okay, well, tones, you know, where do these things come from? And the first point is that natural environments are really poor in tonal sounds. So if you take a microphone out to the beach and you record the sounds of the wind and the water and just natural environmental sounds, you're not going to get a lot of tones. Tones have regularly repeating structure in time. They have a fluctuation rate that's incredibly stable, and you don't get that from these sources. The major exception is bioacoustic sources. So animals, basically. So in this context of this noisy environment, animals have evolved to create periodically repeating sounds that have pitch and they really stand out. And we use them for communication. For us, what is the most relevant biological source of tones? And it's the larynx. So here's the larynx here. It's a complex of cartilage and bone and nerves and blood and muscle. It's a pretty complex organ. It rests here in your throat. The vocal folds here. Air's coming through and setting those folds into vibration. And you know, what is the history of this organ? This organ basically comes from the lungfish. So the first animals that crawled out of the sea and onto the land, they have a little valve for when they go underwater that protects their lungs from flooding. And I think I have a recording. Yeah, so this is a very, very simple organ, right? So we got from here to here, and I think these creatures still live, so, you know, so not so musical, right? Compared to what we can do today with our voice. But it's really a tremendous amount of anatomical change to go from a little valve that has a muscle that can close it and open to what we have today. 400 million years. So, you know, what could have possibly driven this process? This is essentially the story that we tell. I mean, you know, these hypotheses are very hard to test, but we use our larynx to connect with each other, to socialize. We use it to express ourselves. We use it, of course, for language, right, which is a big deal for us humans. And what can I say about its development? So already at the 28th week of gestation, the developing fetus starts to respond to its mother's voice. And this responsiveness develops to such a point that when they are born, they're already attracted to their mother's voice. So they're going to suck more to listen to their mother's voice. They're sensitive to timing differences in their language compared to other languages. So there's really, just right off the bat, there's an attraction there, right? And that implies some sort of integration between their auditory system and these kind of motivational systems, these rewarding systems. It's already getting wired up. And then it becomes, of course, a tool for emotional regulation, right? So if you've ever talked to a child or talked to a baby, your voice, I mean, you can make them cry by speaking in a harsh tone of voice. You can soothe them. And so right away, there seems to be an integration of sound and emotional regulation, reward, attraction. And then, of course, this becomes a scaffold for language processing, right? So that the infant is tuning into its mother's voice and other caretakers' voices, and it's paying attention to all these things. And this becomes how we socialize, how we learn to communicate with each other. So what about the mechanisms here? This is more neural stuff. So the auditory cortex on the side of the brain, sound comes up, goes into there. And then there are all kinds of specialization in your auditory cortices, things like neurons that are sensitive not only to one pitch, but are sensitive to the whole stack of pitches that exist in a tone. There are neurons that are sensitive to particular pitch contours, so like rising, falling. And again, it's an integrated network with all of these kind of affective neurobiology of reward. And it creates this kind of sound-based emotional regulation network. And something that's really interesting about this is that it's reflexive, right? So I'm not trying to say that it's like that it's innate or that it's learned. more that you don't have to do anything. If you hear just like a second of somebody's voice, you can tell a lot about them. You can tell something about how they're feeling. You can tell something about their gender. Tell something about their size, their age. So it's a tremendous amount of information. It just arrives in your perception.
In the studies of how the brain reacts to music, one can conjecture that the reaction will be different if you are listening to music with other people around you. Has this been investigated?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are studies, but they're mostly behavioral. I don't know if there's been any like hyper scanning studies where they're doing that. There's been some like improvisational stuff where they get like jazz musicians together to improvise, but just the effect of having other people in the room while you're listening, I'm not sure about the neural basis of that, but it certainly is a thing behaviorally. So all of this stuff here led my colleagues and I to develop something we call vocal similarity theory, and it's very simple. It's just that the way that musical tones affect us is in accord with our experience over evolutionary time, over developmental time, and the significance of those sounds in the voice and what it means for behavior. So if you hear a harsh tone in music, you can say, okay, well, what does that type of spectral shape implicate in vocal communication? What would that mean? Well, okay, maybe it's a signal of aggression or dominance. Well, this music is communicating a similar type of affect. And you can really use it across the board to understand any sort of like a melody or harmony. Why is this music affecting us in this way? You can go back and say, okay, well, what would this be like in the voice? What would the effort be required to produce it? And therefore ground your thinking about musical affect in terms of these, the voice, which is constrained here, sitting in my larynx inside my body. Okay. So moving on to rhythm, just going to do the same thing here. So rhythm means a lot of different things, a lot of different contexts. In music, it's just really about the temporal patterning of sounds, and its dominant feature is predictability. So even though there are some, you'll hear, there are some cultures, for example, that don't have a clear pulse in their music, like a clear, regular isochronous interval that happens over again. There are some drumming, like djembe drumming traditions from Malia that have a much more complicated pulse structure, but again, it's predictable. So the pulse structure unfolds over time. It's like short, long, and that's really the thing, is that you can glom onto it, you can get into it, you can do it with other people. And so that's really the fundamental feature of rhythm. There are different concepts in rhythm. One is the pulse, which is just, this is the beat, and it has a very constrained range. Interestingly, this range overlaps like almost exactly with like just local motor rhythms. So it seems to be related to body movement. And then there's this concept of meter, which is a lot more complicated than pulse, but basically, in any beat, you're going to have things that are going on faster than the beat and slower than the beat. Things like in a basic rock beat, you'd have like the snare and the hi-hat happening between kicks. There's another fundamental concept here, which is I've already alluded to, which is groove, which is rhythm is connected to movement. So this is like you can't get away from this. So like even if you take somebody and you put them in a brain scanner and you say like don't move, you can't move because you're in the brain scanner, and you play them like a groovy rhythm, their motor areas will light up. So premotor planning you'll light up the whole network just by playing a groovy rhythm. We can't help but have this kind of motor association with rhythm. We think about, where did this come from? Where did this sensitivity we have come from? So this capacity to entrain to a sound, and it's actually fairly rare in primates. So primates have a lot of interesting vocal behaviors. So I got a gibbon in here. I'm not sure where Gabby is, but and howler monkey. So interesting vocal behaviors. But these animals don't entrain. They won't start like if you're playing. If you had a pet gibbon at home and you were playing music all the time, it wouldn't be bopping its head along with you. Yeah. Interestingly, parrots do this. So parrots are one of the only other species that seems to have this capacity. But at least in primates, it doesn't seem to be part of their normal behavioral repertoire. And so that leads to the idea that, oh, maybe is this novel in humans? Why are we so into this? And there are ideas about language learning and vocal learning and the connection that we have to have in order to, between our auditory systems and our motor systems in order to be able to communicate and learn language. So what is its value? These values, again, are the same as they were for tonality. So affect, connection, and language. Here we can think about it even with a little bit more detail. So we know this kind of language speech has a regular temporal structure, peaking around 6 hertz, events happening in speech. And these rhythms, your brain has oscillations that will naturally line up to these rhythms when somebody's talking, and they will help you internalize what's being said. Syllables, phrases, words, they're different overlapping rhythms. In the context of connection, we know that synchrony is a really, synchrony serves affiliation, synchrony serves cohesion and bonding. Very simple experiments like finger tapping, you tap together, you're going to get people reporting that they feel closer to the person they just tapped with. If you force them to tap apart, they're going, I didn't like that person so much. And, national anthems, dance, military drill. There are a lot of examples in kind of just culture of doing things together in time with other people and how it brings us closer together. And the simple saying is when you move together, you groove together. So all of the same things that I talked about in the context of tonality also apply here. The rhythmic elements of the voice also play a role in emotional regulation. The developing fetus is learning these patterns, these temporal patterns, and being attracted to them. Things like tempo, things like how varied my cadence is, and what that might mean if I'm really low energy and I just kind of talk like this. And, it's just very. It has an emotional quality to it, the timing of my voice. We know a fair amount about this. I alluded to this a little bit a second ago, that rhythm, this kind of rhythm network really involves the processing of auditory information coming up through your auditory centers and going down over to your motor cortices and then coming back down in a loop. And this kind of cortical basal ganglia thalamic loop just gets stimulated by rhythm. And it's very robust, and it's a very large swath of your nervous system that gets engaged in this way. And when it does, it also gets coupled to your reward systems that I was showing earlier. So groove is inherently pleasurable. If you're in a groove, you're taking part in that, it's fun. So as kind of to frame up this body of theory, there's something called neural resonance theory. And that's the idea that rhythm, sensitivity to rhythm, depends on these endogenous oscillations that are happening in your auditory system and your motor system, and they spontaneously entrain when you hear regularly repeating stimuli, and they modulate your receptivity to it, they modulate your ability to predict what's going to happen, motor planning. So that's kind of how we can use biology to think about these concepts in music, like tonality and rhythm, so we don't have to just say, we can't really talk about these from a scientific perspective. They just have to leave it wholly in the domain of art. No, we can start to think about why it is that we have these behaviors and what they could mean for us. So, just to recap, the biological foundations of music in phylogeny, function, development, and mechanism provide a basis for scientific understanding, and that's kind of the bridge to the medical context. So you have to have this piece there. You have to be able to think in these terms if you're going to use it in a rational way to try to affect disease. Okay, any questions here before? Go ahead.
I was wondering, you had that question mark by human uniqueness for rhythm, and what do you make of chimpanzees, for example, drumming on the buttresses of trees?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting behavior, and we should definitely do more research on it. Like the tests that show how we synchronize, we're so good at it. So if you test it in a lab, what they do is they'll say, okay, we'll get this animal to tap at a certain rate or to entrain to a tempo, but then they change the tempo. And typically the animal will be like, oh, well, I don't know what to do with this, right? But we do that flexibly. You change the tempo on us, we'll just speed up, we'll slow down, we'll anticipate what's going on. The other thing we'll do is we will anticipate the beat so that we tap on time. Whereas if you train an animal to tap, they'll typically lag the beat. There are some examples of chimpanzees being able to do some of this, but it just doesn't seem to be as robust of a thing for them. I'm totally open to the idea that it's not like a categorical boundary and they can't do anything at all, but like we excel. We excel in this system.
They don't do it socially then, where it's usually one individual doing it as a kind of display. So
Yeah.
there's no like social synchronization or anything like
Right.
that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're kind of like, and it seems like it's pretty fun. Make like a loud drumming sound in the jungle and have it propagate off, right? But yeah, maybe we probably have to get into those forests and check out what's going on more. Any other questions?
I still want to comment about that, and I can tell you more about it, but there are a couple of animals that do dances, like capuchins do have these dances they do in which they exchange rhythmic grunts.
Oh, fascinating.
Nothing going on tonally, they're terrible at that, but the rhythm, yeah. And then long-tailed mannequins also do a dance, and they're rewarded by Female Choice for dancing, and they practice at the beginning of the lutting season. Their rhythm is terrible, and it improves with time, and the
Very
females do seem to prefer the ones that are
Very
better,
cool.
more coordinated dancers.
Yeah, so, just these are great questions, and just to the, animal behavior is amazing in so many ways, and there's so we know so little, and I think there's some really interesting comparative work to be done. We can start to think about the underlying circuitry, but we do, if not stand completely apart, we are on the extreme of this continuum. Okay, so to launch into this, to mental health, so first thing is mental health is physical health, right? So unless you're a Cartesian dualist, this is where I come at this problem from. And psychiatry is really just the branch of medicine that's focused on disorders of brain function. So I have to say this anytime I'm not talking in the psychiatry department, because for me, psychiatry always had like a stigma attached to it. And when I found myself working in the psychiatry department, I had to kind of understand, okay, well, what's really going on here? And how do I think about it in the context of all the other things that are happening in the world? So people are very sick. Sometimes those disorders originate in the brain. This is how I think of psychiatric medicine. And again, it's really on the focus clinically is really on functioning. So, are you having a problem, right? Like anything in the spectrum of human individuality and difference is totally fine. It's when you show up at the clinic, it's because you're having a problem. Your functioning is impaired in a way that's preventing you from maintaining your relationships, your job, your ability to be yourself. And it turns out that this is a massive problem, which you all know. But the prevalence of mental illness just in the U.S. is really large. So one in six disproportionately affects young people. So this age range here, which is interesting because this is also the range at which music engagement peaks. We can just look at depression here is affecting 19% of our people, our adults. Suicides have been going up consistently for a long time. Anxiety disorders are up to 22%. During the pandemic, this shot way up, and it hasn't come back down. And the economic impact of this is huge. So all of these things limit your ability to work, and the estimated costs of just anxiety are up here. What is this? $1 trillion. So that leads me to the concept of using music in a clinical capacity. So music for mental health, question mark. So I think the appropriate starting point for thinking about this is just that people are already using music to support their mental health. So if you go and you ask people, is music important to your mental health? If you do it all over the globe, about 3/4 of people will say, yes, it's incredibly important to my mental health. And this is just a survey, it was done during COVID, of the top reasons that people listen to music. And if you look at these, they're all basically related to regulating your emotions. And you might even group them further into antidepressant and anxiolytic effects. So kind of these two pillars of psychiatric dysfunction, depression and anxiety. I mean, these are things that people are using music for all the time. So that, I think, is the right foundation for thinking about this. I told you a little bit about the young adults. These are graphs of kind of musical engagement over time. So as you can see, peaking here, 19 to 24, over 4 hours a day, people listening to music. Okay, if you ask them, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm using it to manage my negative moods. I'm using it to manage my positive moods. I actually think that these graphs probably should be more like this, but what happens here is you get kind of busy, right? You have to work. You can't just like listen to music all day, right? But people do continue to listen to music and continue to enjoy music, continue to be engaged with it. But there is something interesting happening here in this kind of late adolescence and into like your early kind of mating time. Young people are also especially averse to drug therapy. So if you ask, people already don't really people prefer behavioral and psychological interventions to drug interventions, approximately 3 to 1 in the general population. Young people even more so. And you think a lot of these side effects are social, so emotional blunting, sexual dysfunction, like all these things. These are important things. If you're giving people drugs during this time of life when you're trying to form your social bonds, and those drugs are systematically affecting your ability to do that, it's a problem. So this is all kind of the motivation for going in a musical direction. Talk therapy can be very effective, but there's a lot of stigma around it. Also, during this phase of life, people are looking for autonomy. It's also costly. So the promise of music therapies. So these are just summary effect sizes from common psychiatric disorders. This is the standardized mean difference. So this is how many standard deviations you're being moved. And these are large studies. So, I don't know where it was a surprise to me when I started looking into this literature. It's like, wow, there's been a lot of work done. So here you go, 67 controlled studies, over 4,000 patients. This is a large effect size. Yeah, and the same is true for anxiety and autism and schizophrenia. Music therapies are effective, particularly when you start to compare it to the best things that we have in psychiatric medicine. So these are based on huge meta-analyses, and the rule of thumb almost across the board in psychiatry is what you're doing will probably help about 1/3 of patients. Yeah, so 2/3 of people will not be helped, which is not a great place to be. The one thing I will say is that because there's so much more data here, and there's a lot of data here, but there's much less, I would expect these to come down over time as we get more data. But still, there's a lot of interest in what are called novel therapeutics, novel ways of pursuing mental health. So we have this evidence. Music-based interventions have clinically relevant benefits, and they're very broad. They apply to a wide range of mental illness. So what's the problem? Why don't we just do this, right? Why don't we switch out our psychiatric clinics for music therapy clinics? Let's talk a little bit about music therapy. So this is really the dominant mode of treatment. Music therapy is 70 years old in its current instantiation. People have been using music for healing for a long time, but shamanistic traditions. But in the modern instantiation, music therapy is the dominant mode. 70 years old, started in inpatient veteran care after World War II, special education. The problem is it's highly heterogeneous in approach and practice. So here are just some examples of music therapy. So everything from kind of jamming with your music therapist to bathing in sound to dancing underwater. Drum circles. So there's just a lot going on. Music is really broad, and this book is now in its 3rd edition. It's called Defining Music Therapy, and this is the definition that they arrive at: a systematic process of intervention wherein the therapist helps the client to promote health using music and the relationships that develop. So the therapist is really the thing that becomes central to this definition. If you want to call what you're doing music therapy, you have to have a trained music therapist there doing the intervention. That's a 4-year degree. So most people do it as an undergraduate, but it's really a passion, a calling of passion. You come out, you don't necessarily make a lot of money, and There's inconsistent insurance reimbursement. It's not, despite the effects, despite it being effective, it's very limited in its impact. And the fundamental reason is we just don't have enough music therapists. So we have, there in the United States, there are about 11,000 board-certified music therapists. Average caseload, 30 patients per week, total treatment capacity, and we're dealing with 60 million people with mental illness. So it's a bit of a non-starter in terms of growing the impact of music on mental health in a clinical capacity. And it's also that we have no standard tools. We have no validated standard forms of music therapy that we can take and administer in a quick way. So this brings me to what I'm doing now, which is trying to build these things I call STAMs, and these are standardized, adaptable music medicines. So what does this all mean? So they're standardized in terms of their protocol, so very clear treatment protocol, and also in terms of the biological mechanism of action. We're specifically trying to engage your reward system, specifically trying to deliver pleasure and motivate your effective circuitry. They're adaptable, so this is really important, right? So if all of these effects on your brain are set into proportion to enjoyment, individual enjoyment, we have to know something about what you enjoy. We have to be able to deliver that to you. It's not going to do anything giving you calm music that you hate, if you're trying to calm down. It's probably going to make you more angry. And music medicine is a kind of a parallel field to music therapy, and it's really emphasizing music. That's what they call it, medicine. It's like taking a pill. So it's like as needed self-administration, probably how most of us listen to music all the time. The other thing that is involved in making these STAMs is that they're made for a mobile health context. We all own smartphones, and most of us, this is from 2016, 87% of people were using it to stream music in 2016. It's probably much higher now. Music is really well suited to this. So I have 3 projects going. I have a STAM for depression, STAM for suicide, and a STAM for anxiety. And they all kind of play on the same mechanisms and the same therapeutic approaches. I'll just talk to you a little bit about what those are now. ISO music, preferred music, and musical agency. So just a little bit here about the opportunity quickly. A lot of different talks will have a graph like this saying, oh, what I'm doing is growing, right? But there's interest growing in music and medicine and health. There's funding initiatives from the National Institutes of Health. It's partnered with the Kennedy Center for the Arts, and they're really set off to try to promote the role of music as a therapeutic modality, not just a form of entertainment, something that we can really use to help ourselves systematically. There's also a lot of industry interest in this space. A lot of companies, Spotify, Apple Music, are involved in trying to, you'll see, like they have focus playlists, right? They have anti-anxiety playlists. Just so I consult for a handful of these companies, just for full transparency. I'm going to talk to you now about some of the work I've done with Spiritune. So with Spiritune, we set out to create something called ISO music. And under the larger goal of combining music neuroscience, which is my expertise, music therapy, there's a very good music therapist on the team, and a bunch of composers. And the goal was to get together and try to create music that people can use to regulate their emotions. And the approach that we take is something called affective parameterization, which is just to take, you map out a space here. This is a kind of Russell two-dimensional environment space, emotion space with arousal and valence. And you might think about how these different areas can be realized acoustically. And this is based, again, on the bioacoustics. So if I'm feeling really anxious and my chest is really tight and I'm talking, my voice is going to have a certain quality. And those things translate really well into music. And there's been a lot of research on musical affect, vocal affect, acoustic affect, and trying to understand what these principles are. So what we did is just parameterize this space in terms of musical features. And there's something from music therapy, which is called the ISO principle. And this is a fundamental kind of therapeutic rule. It's just that music needs to meet you where you're at before trying to change how you feel. So a music therapist will come into the room with you, they'll ask you questions, they'll read your affect, and they'll play music that is kind of matched to how you're feeling. And then say you say you're lethargic and you want to be energized, they'll start to introduce musical changes that bring up your energy level over time. And so I came with this literature, and the music therapist came with this, and we put these things together, and we gave these kind of parameters to composers. And I was very skeptical of this. These are just words on paper. I was like, how is this going to work? But of course, the composers totally get it, and they have their own intuitions about how music should be structured to convey different emotions. And the music they came back with was really great. And what it is it maps different trajectories through this space. So we have different tracks like lethargic to energized, like anxious to chill. And at this point, there are over 400 tracks. And we go through a process of iterative composition and review, and we go back and forth, we tune up the parameters. And here's an example of one. This is an anxious to chill trajectory. This is from the workflow context. So this music is designed to support you while you're doing a task. Maybe not your deepest task where you're like synergizing information from different sources and making new connections, but a lot of the more repetitive, more monotonous tasks that we engage in every day. This music is designed for that context, to not be too distracting, but also supply you with some emotional support. So let's play the first part here. It starts with anxious, dissonant tones, looming low frequency noise, temporal unpredictability, and then later on the track just becomes full-fledged. There's solid groove, there's tonal elements, and it's very stable. And this is a 10-minute track. So this is just data from Spiritune users. So you come into the app, you report how you feel. Most people are coming in anxious or lethargic. You report how do you want to feel. We actually don't let them say you want to go to these places because it's supposed to be therapeutic, but you could do this. Like in film scoring. And there's, very high success rate, but this is, there's no controls here. This is not experimental data. So we set out to do a study, and this study just came out a couple days ago. But basically, we set out to compare isomusic against other types of music, sample of pop music from the Billboard Hot 100, focus music, this is from Spotify's Deep Focus playlist, which is advertised in a similar way, and just a sample of office noise that was kind of our silent condition. And we're looking at effects on mood and performance. So the first thing is that we saw a mood effect. So isomusic did have an effect on people's total affect, both decreasing negative affect and increasing positive affect. And this was independent of how people were coming in with in terms of their depression and their anxiety and their stress levels. So typically anxiety, so they were also doing a cognitive task during the listening. They were doing a flanker task. You have to say which way the arrow is pointing, depending on whether there's distractors or not. And if you're anxious, if you have high anxiety here, this is self-reported anxiety, you will perform more slowly. So anxiety interferes with cognition. If you're feeling really anxious, you don't perform as well. But the nice thing is that we got this effect of the Spiritune isomusic, where over the course of the trial, this is trial number down here on the x-axis, this reaction time. So over the course of 80 trials, people just got faster and faster. They learned and they got faster at performing the task. This wasn't the case for any of the other conditions. And the nice thing is that this was true whether you had mild anxiety or whether you had moderate anxiety or whether you had severe anxiety. So if you score this highly on this screener, maybe you have to, well, you don't have to, but maybe you get recommended to go see a doctor and maybe they prescribe you drugs. But this effect of the music was stable across all of these different conditions. So that was encouraging. Okay, so that's isomusic or affective parameterization, trying to control the affect that the music is communicating and how it's sequenced to try to move you systematically through affect space. The other thing is, another thing is preferred music. So this is the point I made. Music you like best is the best for stimulating you and stimulating your brain. What will happen is that sometimes the music you like will be misaligned with your goals, right? So in depression, it's not always the case, but sometimes you prefer really sad music, and you will use it to maintain and exacerbate your sadness even. So it can have a negative effect on you. It can be unhealthy. There's also something that happens when you listen to music. You get these kind of musically evoked autobiographical memories. In depression and in anxiety, these can be very negative. So oh, I remember this song. This is the song that I used to listen to in that relationship that was dysfunctional and ended up not working. I listened to the song a lot during my previous struggles with mental health. So preferred music is just tricky. Like you'll hear music therapists say like, I don't really want to, I'm going to create new music for these people because I don't want to deal with their baggage that they're coming in with this that they may not even know about, right? So they go in and listen to their favorite song, but actually it's invoking this memory of something in their past, and it's doing damage. So, the challenge is how can we rapidly find out what a person likes and also bring it into alignment with their goals. All of the music streamers are doing this, right? They're rapidly identifying preferred music. Your Spotify Discover Weekly, the algorithms are all geared towards getting you to spend time in the app by providing you with what you like. The challenge is to do this, to make music recommendation algorithms that are therapeutically sensitive. Yeah. So the way that we're trying to do this is with Gaussian mixture models. My postdoc here, Juan Gomez-Quignon. We basically have people come in and rate music, not only in how much they like it. There's a big space of music, and they rate how much they like, but they also rate it in terms of its effects on their energy levels, their arousal, and whether they think it's positive or negative. And by doing this, you can start to predict, okay, well, if I want to give this person music that is going to make them excited, but that's positive, or let's say that they're feeling anxious, they're excited and they're feeling negative. I want to deliver them a song that mirrors how they're feeling, ISO principle, and then I want to move them towards songs that are going to be low energy positive. Right? This gives you the ability to do that with pre-recorded music. Okay, this final piece that I'm going to talk about in terms of the things that I'm doing is called musical agency. So this is just giving people control over musical sound. If you're a musician, this is like you love doing this. Like you can pick up your instrument and you can communicate how you feel. You can shape the feelings of other people in the room through your skill, right? But we're not all musicians, right? So this kind of quirky video. I met this guy at a conference in Germany. He brought all these weight machines into the lobby of the hotel, and they're all hooked up to music production software, right? So I started jamming with him by doing these things, and he's looking me in the eye, and he's like, yeah, we're all connecting and stuff. But it's just this way of delivering musical agency to people. It's a little loud, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so you can see what it... I love it. I'm going to see Tom in a couple days. I hope he doesn't mind that I'm showing this video. Yeah, so, you don't have to be a musician to be given with our digital tools, our digital things that we can do with music production software. You can give people a knob and allow them to control a parameter of music that has a tremendous amount of power over its affect and what it communicates and its impact on your brain. I'm just going to show you here. So this is kind of the therapeutic interface that we use. And so, sorry it's so loud. But so so just to the point that the digital algorithms are getting so good now that you can start to toy with these parameters. You can change the tempo of your music without changing the pitch, with no distortion, and therefore, yeah, like let's take your favorite song, but now you want to use it to calm yourself down. So we're going to move the tempo down, and we're going to teach you how to get into the groove of it, and we're going to teach you how to slow yourself down with it. This is what a therapist would do, a music therapist in some context if you're dealing with anxiety. Things like frequency filtering. This stimulates your cortical arousal, so it's very hard to pay attention to something if you've got high frequency energy, but we can strip that right away. So you could turn Thriller into something that you could even use to study. That wouldn't be my choice, but yeah. So the idea is giving people control, asking them to participate behaviorally and take an active role in it, teaching them a little bit about energy in music and affect in music and what you can do very simply to control that and how you want to control it for yourself in different contexts. No. It's locking me out. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Okay. Really wants to show that. Okay. Yeah, so we've done a lot of research on musical agency, all kinds of things. People like to have it. Again, this is all from the exercise context, but you have mood effects. You have effects on pleasure, self-efficacy, pain tolerance. So if you work out with musical agency or without, then you go put your hand in ice water. You can hold your hand in for ice water for longer. Perceived effort. So if you have this kind of synchronized music, it doesn't feel so difficult. There's also some evidence for greater muscular efficiency in the context of this kind of synchrony. Okay. Oh yeah, I think I just did this. Okay. Yeah, and that tempo, the time stretching algorithm was built by another collaborator of mine, expert in digital signal processing. And again, so with these controls plus some teaching, you can get people pretty capable in terms of self-administration. Okay, so just this is really the final piece now. It's all about, for me, in thinking about therapeutic uses of music, it's all about how do you drive this system and how do you drive it in a way that's aligned with somebody's therapeutic goals. I'll just briefly touch on this one paper. It's pretty heavy on the neuroscience side, but it's really remarkable work, came out of China, and they took these patients who have treatment-resistant depression, and they're sick enough to have deep brain electrodes implanted in their brain. So these are electrodes that are running down into your nucleus accumbens, your pleasure center, and this BNST, it's extended amygdala, so it's involved in anxiety, and they recorded, instead of stimulating in this paradigm, they're recording from these electrodes at the same time as they have surface level EEG. So you have these two signals synced up. It's very rare to get this type of data from humans, obviously. But they found a couple of really interesting things. So one thing they found is this. So the first point here is like, oh yeah, the antidepressant effects, the anxiolytic effects of music they happen in proportion to your enjoyment. Yeah. But now they started to be able to measure what that meant for these deep brain structures and for the temporal EEG. The enjoyment predicted synchrony between the temporal EEG and the music waveform. So, it's like to the extent that the music is getting into your brain, to the extent that you can record the temporal structure from electrodes placed on your above your auditory cortices, that is reflecting how much you're enjoying the music. So I don't know, Apple has a patent for in-ear EEG, so the headphones, right? So 10 years time, these things are going to be able to pick up some of this temporal lobe activity. You're going to be able to determine, okay, well, this music is getting in or it's not getting in. And then even more interesting than this is that during these periods of enhanced synchrony, they had enhanced power in the theta range, which is just a certain frequency range, 4 to 8 hertz. This is showing all this yellow here is high theta. Oh no, this is the synchrony. You're getting more theta power in the high enjoyment music listeners than the low enjoyment, in whether it's familiar music or unfamiliar music. And this is then correlating, this theta activity that you can pick up from the scalp is correlating with these bursts of higher frequency activity in these deep brain structures. So it seems that something to do, so if your temporal lobes sync up with the music, then you have this theta activity that's maybe reflecting neural communication to deep brain structures, and then you're having this time-locked stimulating activity in these deep brain structures. So this is kind of a model for the neuroscience of how music can affect these systems that are affected in your core problems like anxiety and depression. A really interesting piece of this was that they took the people who weren't responding to the music, so the people who didn't really enjoy it all that much, and they seeded that music with theta amplitude modulation. So just take the music, and now they're going to go whoa, 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 whoa at 4 hertz, 6 hertz, and that was enough to increase the antidepressant effects of the music and to increase this gamma and temporal phase locking. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks, this was super interesting. I'm just curious about how long the effects of music therapy tend to last. Like, do people, when you look at the effect sizes of the, antidepressant drugs, for example, right? The
Right.
effect size of this seems to be much bigger, but is it also much shorter in
So
span?
in most of those studies, they're also looking at immediate follow-up of the psychiatric studies. But you raise a really good point, and that's probably one of the biggest holes in the data when it comes to music therapy is like the long-term effects of the intervention 3 months out, 6 months out. We really don't know. But I think the general kind of operating hypothesis is that you have to be doing these things. The effects are going to decrease over time if you stop. There's some evidence for prolonged effects in the context of autism, in the context of depression, but in general, you probably have to continue doing these things. But it's the same. It's the same with psychotherapy. It's the same with pharmacotherapy. So, I think there's a lot of comparability there. It's a great question.
Yeah, thanks for, now I will always understand what's happening when I get chills.
Cool.
Which is great. So I had a question about the study that you put up from class 1.
Yeah.
You had the 3 different types of music intervention, and then you had office space.
Yeah.
And I was curious if you contemplated other potential alternatives to office space. So I was thinking, why not choose something like ambient sound from a forest, or something that's
Totally.
perhaps more connected to a natural environment instead of a built environment, sort of in this, particularly in this space of thinking about depression and
Yeah.
isolation and things that perhaps are triggering to negative.
Yeah, okay, I know it sounds bad, but actually the office-based sound generator that we use is like people use it for like to study and to work to. So it's like a chill, yeah, it's like a chill, nice office space as they go, right? Like, the natural environments are really interesting. Like there is work on soundscapes, natural soundscapes. I've played around with some of it myself. I mean, it's like how variable is it, right? It's like if the wind picks up, you got to start paying attention, right? Like, or maybe you're listening and you're in a groove and you're working, but then like a crow lands, right? Like, right? So it's like all these things that are like, what's actually happening. But I do think, noise is great. Noise is super stable. I think for like deeper focus tasks, something that's even more minimalistic, even more stable makes a lot of sense. Some things like for like sleep applications, like things like waves, right? That can be really good. But yeah, I think, people often comment on that office space thing, and like also like why don't you do silence instead? We made that choice. I don't know whether we would make it again, but we had 4 conditions. It's a lot of people, and we just went with it. But it's a good point.
I have a bit of a related question to Abby, but when you brought up the parameterization of sound, I was thinking in my head, could you do this with like a stereotyped call, like a howler monkey call, or like the sound repertoire of a monkey or something?
Yeah.
Like, and could you maybe plot that on the map, and would you hypothesize then if people were listening to these different monkey calls, would you see an effect of their mood?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think you definitely could. You need some insight, right? Like you can't get them to do the ratings necessarily, but you can. There are some efforts to try to get valence and arousal out of animal calls, right?
I mean with humans, like could you have a human listen to the calls of monkeys
Yeah.
and maybe
Yeah, you could do it. Yeah, why not? You know, I had like a project where I did a lot of like a comparative vocalization work, and I ended up with this huge database of vocalizations from 90 species, and I gave it to my musician friend, and he cut it all up into like a song. I think yeah, like so what's the advantage, I guess, of doing that? I mean, I think you can. I think any sort of sound has these basic qualities that you can manipulate and plot it in that space and potentially use it. I'm sorry, the howler monkey is just like in my brain right now. I'm just thinking about like trying to work to like a howler monkey. Yeah, there's like take the gibbons, right, or something that's a little bit more melodic, right, or like birdsong. I mean, I think musicians draw inspiration from that stuff already. But we've done all of this work. Humans have done all this work to build these instruments to kind of titrate out the elements of sound that we care about, and that we build these sound generators, and we've got these knobs, and it's kind of a filter, But yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Do you think there could be, so this is all sort of from the treatment side, but from the diagnostic side, some benefit of using music or sounds to either for someone to be aware of their own sort of emotional state or to diagnose things that might benefit from musical treatments?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've done some work in autism in the context of trying to understand. There's kind of a paradox in autism, which is like the notion is that people with autism are not super tuned into affect, right? But then people with autism also tend to really like music. So music is all about affect. So there's kind of a paradox there. So I built like a diagnostic tool that's based on rating affect in speech, but all the speech is filtered out. It's based on larynx recordings. And so far, it seems that the kids with autism are doing okay with those stimuli. In terms of understanding like where to intervene and what the musical sensitivity is and how that's relevant, like I think about it in terms of like, who are the people who are most likely to benefit from musical treatment? So you can do things like you can administer a survey called the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire. It's 20 questions long, gives you a good idea of how sensitive somebody is to music. You can evaluate their sensitivity to tonality. You can evaluate their sensitivity to rhythm. And maybe that helps you design an intervention for them, right? So you can say, well, if you don't like music, probably not going to be the best thing for you, right? And if you like music but you're really tuned into rhythm, maybe that's the place to focus. So I think there are ways of structuring treatment around individuals. And in the social domain, it also, like, should this be a group therapy? Should it not be group therapy? Do you have social anxiety? There are lots of interesting questions there.
Thanks, Professor. I really enjoyed your talk. Particularly, the idea of like music therapy as intervention, reshaping neural circuits, neuroplasticity, and thinking through your slide about tonality, and going back to it, and thinking through the evolutionary lens of how tonal cues were used by early hominins, right, to essentially for survival as precursors to the emergence of formalized language, right, and then moving past that, I guess, going deeper into that tonality that you were speaking about and different mechanisms through it. And then I guess I'm coming at it from like a linguistic perspective, right? Thinking through tonal languages, right? Like for example, Mandarin, Apache, Navajo, right? We know that pitch contours in these languages, right, shape the meaning through fine-tuned neural sensitivity, like leads to adaptation and plasticity, right? So I guess like thinking through those pathways related to pitch, right? Like absolute pitch, relative pitch contour. I'm wondering if you guys have perhaps explored or thought through ways in which perhaps these music interventions are shaping and reshaping both like, neuroplasticity at the individual level and how maybe that has some sort of associations to the way language emerge and develop, right, as an evolutionary adaptation. So I'm really curious if you could speak
Yeah,
more about
okay, yeah. Great question. I mean, I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, Yeah, so there's plasticity, right? So if you train, right, like if you train in music, especially when you're young, you're going to reshape your auditory system to be sensitive, more sensitive to these things. Maybe become better at trainment. Garrett and I were just talking this morning about effects on speech and noise. Like the tone languages are very interesting, right? Like so you have enhanced sensitivity. So there's higher prevalence of perfect pitch, for example, in Mandarin-speaking cultures. So in terms of what that means, I'm just trying to, in my mind, trying to connect it to the evolutionary significance. I'm not sure. A lot of what you're saying kind of resonates with me in the context of sound symbolism and how certain types of pitch contours are better for expressing certain types of things. I think there's some really interesting things going on there, and there may be some symbolism there that was played a role in early development of communication systems evolution. But I have no real insight into that. Thanks.
Like, given a person who's in their 20s who's depressed, and then someone in their 60s or 70s, would the same music
Great question.
work?
Yeah, so very frequently what a music therapist will do for an older population is they'll say, okay, well, what is the music? Like in dementia, for example, they'll just infer from where they were when they were 18 to 25, and they'll play songs from that era. And that seems to work pretty well for the most part. I don't know, when we build these types of music interventions, we try to stay really like genre agnostic. We try to focus really on the acoustics because I don't want to use like an instrument that's going to make you think, oh, this is bluegrass or something. I don't like that, or like, oh, I don't like this rhythmic motif, We want it to be very basic and very available. But in that element of preference, in that element of exactly getting you with the music that you love, it's important to know those things.
Diagnosing like a person's like state, like whether they're excited or they're like depressed. It seems like it's pretty like standardized and there's like a pattern to it. So do you think, or do you know if like AI is being used to create music therapy, or what do you think about AI?
Yeah, it's going down. It's happening. You can't stop it. Yeah, I mean, I think. There's a lot of generative music, right? And you look at this kind of thing where you're like mapping in this space. This is like exactly what it's good at, It's exactly like, okay, well, you can parameterize the whole thing in some sort of range, and you can start to move people around in that space. I think that the AI, the current instantiations are not quite there yet in terms of the generative music to be able to do that effectively in a very specific way. There needs to be individual tuning, just like the kind of stuff that we're doing here. I think it's coming. I think there are battles that are going to be fought there in terms of like copyright and what's being scrubbed and like what and there's also like a weird thing that happens with listening to music. If you can provide somebody with an AI generated song and they can really like it. But then if you tell them that it was created by a machine, sometimes it changes everything, or sometimes not. Some people don't care. So I kind of think that there's kind of an inevitability to some of that stuff coming down the road, but I'm still like waiting for that piece of AI generated music that makes people cry and that's around 300 years later. There's still a test to pass there. I don't necessarily doubt that it'll be passed, but.
Are done with the patient as the listener as opposed to the producer of music. And at least in my own experience, the kinds of music that I would choose to change my mood as a producer of music are completely different from those that I would choose if I were just going to listen to something. And I'm just wondering how generalizable that phenomenon is. Maybe I'm just weird, but at least in my family, that seems to be a tendency.
That's super cool. Yeah, so in music therapy, there's a split. There's active music therapy and receptive music therapy. Yeah. So active is you're participating in making the music, and the thing is that it's like experimentally, it's like very hard to control because it really depends on somebody's individual skills and it depends on the teacher and that interaction. I try to build in some of that here with the agency piece. Like that's really what that's about. It's about giving people control and having them actively participate in the creation process. But when
It still might not feel the same as generating it from your own voice or your own
absolutely.
actions.
The one thing I can say that's data driven is that when they look in the studies and the meta-analyses and they compare active therapies to receptive therapies, there's no advantage of either way or the other, you know? It may, you know, it's probably case specific, right? So if you can get somebody to produce music, my assumption would just be that that's going to be the best, right? Like, because they're really engaged, they're making it themselves, but they got to feel good about it, right? They got to not judge it. There's a lot of pieces there. And I am interested in thinking about that going forward in ways that we can expand access to that kind of stuff. But this is kind of like the easiest step to the next level is to do it receptively.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if you have any insights on how your area or similar areas might resist some of the stereotyping of like music therapy is too fluffy, especially like looking at the medication example versus the music therapy.
Yeah, I think it's changing. I think that the data's in, you know, and it's like you can't really defend it, you know, and you know, I mean, psychiatry has had the least success of the branches of medicine. I mean, the brain is complicated, right? Like you're dealing with somebody's the entire sum of their experience, their nervous system, their environment. So it's understandable, but there's just no grounds to stand on to say, oh, we shouldn't be looking at these other things that help. Because, I mean, then you see that. You see psychedelic medicine, right, like coming back to the fore. You see music therapies, art therapies, all kinds of things. People are interested in other ways because it's not really working that well. And yeah, music is neurobiologically real, right? You know it, you feel it.
I always think about taking into I always think about how the infant's mind is developing and like early music experience, and I'm always like them wondering how music childhood affects the sound mind as well. And given that music has this really strong impact on neurobiological circuits and what it's contributing, how do you think that shapes like so? I have a lot of friends that have kids now, and like they listen to a lot of hip hop, for example.
Yeah.
A couple things. One is how much does your attention play a role in how much you're processing the music? So like for example, if something's on in the background, like a TV on in the background, how much of that are you quote unquote processing? I don't know if that's the right phrasing.
Yeah.
And then secondly, how much is that and in what ways might that affect or shape the infant's growing auditory?
Yeah, that's super interesting. You know, yeah, you got to do some longitudinal studies, right? Like, that's difficult. Yeah, attention definitely modulates your response to music to a large degree. You know, it's hard to like maintain focus a lot of the time. It's hard to constantly maintain focus. I think a lot of the effective music listening in the kind of therapeutic context happens in like a context where you're awake and relaxed, right? Like you don't really have other stuff going on that you're attending to instead, but your attentional system is not being super rigorously engaged. It's just kind of flowing in. And what was your first question you said in there about the infants and the development? Oh, yeah. I just want to say that, like, you know, the musicality of speech we talked about a little bit. It's like it's such a big deal. It's just like that's the primary thing. It's not the song that's on the radio. It's how people are talking to you and what your voice sounds like. And there's so much song also. There's so much infant-directed song, right? Like parents sing and they use motherese to regulate, and that's the primary thing. That's what this thing is set up to grok, right? Like that's how it's operating, and you know, music is an abstraction, like instrumental music. The lullaby that the little toy plays is an abstraction. You know, it's not. This is the primary thing: the voice, the singing to your child. I think that's probably the best way to shape the plasticity of the system. And I would imagine that has more effect than the hip hop playing in the background of the show. Yeah,
thought about how
yeah,
you
yeah.
approach.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, the lyrics, so yeah, we avoid them. It's really like for you're trying to focus, like lyrics hurt, you know, like especially if you're doing anything linguistic, like writing. But yeah, you know, all this kind of stuff like, oh, the lyrics are depressing, you're going to get depressed. There's actually like no evidence for that. You know, very frequently you're listening to your favorite song, you can't even tell what they're saying, right? Like you think for like 30 years, your favorite song, you thought they were saying one thing and then you find out something else, right? Or there's songs that are like, you know, I don't know if you know that song, like All the Cool Kids, like all the cool kids with the pumped up kicks, you know, like that song's about school shooting, you know? Like so it's like, but it has this like, the affect is positive. So, you know, what is it, I don't know that the lyrics are really shaping the, but your question is about singing and like, yeah, there are interventions that are designed around singing, especially for breath control and for motor problems and speech problems. There are singing style interventions that are interesting and also like melodic intonation, like when you speak, like trying to do it in a pitch-based way to kind of help you as a guide is an interesting thing. But yeah, in terms of access and like giving people the tools to do it like a first approximation, I've been focusing on the receptive stuff.
Have you done research on the magnitude of protective effects for music based off of the level of involvement? So it's just like passive listening. Now you change the dial. Well, what if you change the dial with a group of people, or now you're like dancing to music, you know, in synchrony with a bunch of other people? Like,
right.
is the how long? If you looked at like the duration that you might have these protective effects based off of?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I have not. You know, I think the assumption that like the more you do, the better, like seems like a pretty good assumption to me. I would certainly be interested in testing something like that. But the evidence that exists, again, is not showing clear differences. Like it's showing, like you can compare like a therapist like playing music to you versus listening to headphones versus you playing the piano with them back and forth versus doing song listening and then discussing with them. You compare all these things, there's not really a difference in terms of the effect that we can measure. So, you know, maybe we're just not doing the right measurements. Maybe it would be something like you say, where you're going to look longer out in time. It's hard to imagine that having, if you can create that experience where you're going to dance with a group of people and you're all going to feel good together, and like, I'm sure that would be great, you know. But if I were to say to you, like, check out this intervention, everybody, like, get up, let's dance,
Yeah.
like, yeah. All right. Anybody else?
I guess we are at time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.